Thanks, Caroline, for joining us today. Feel free to begin.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Again, I just want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Caroline Sweatt Eldredge, and I am a licensed counselor in private practice at Houston at Memorial Heights Counseling. You may notice that I'm from Houston, which was recently impacted by the severe weather and flooding across our region, and so many in our city are recovering and currently engaging in the healing process following this collective trauma. And so this information, as I was preparing, feels more relevant than ever. I want to talk a little bit about the title of the presentation, Facing the Dragon. Facing the Dragon is a reference to the work of Sue Johnson. She's an attachment-focused relationship theorist, and she's the founder of emotionally focused couples therapy. She talks about this idea of couples facing the dragon of trauma together. And I've always thought this is such an apt metaphor for the work our clients must do as we help them move forward toward healing. Healing from trauma means facing our fear and finding ways to live courageously in light of our fear and in light of our history. So with that in mind, let's get started. Okay. So we have three primary objectives today, and I'm going to try to help you guys answer three big questions about trauma. The first one is, what is trauma? So what's the definition of trauma? When we're talking about trauma, what is it we mean? What are we looking for and screening for within our clients? And you'll see a common theme throughout the presentation today, and that's that I try to widen our understanding of what all of these things mean. We also want to look at, how does trauma impact us? And we want to get really practical with this. We want to figure out what the impact of trauma looks like in our day-to-day lives, in our relationships, and all aspects of our life. And then finally, the question that us as practitioners are asking ourselves, what is trauma-informed care? How do we utilize all this information as we care for people who've experienced trauma in their life? Okay, so what I would really like to do, just to kind of get an idea before we get started, is to ask you guys a question. So I'm going to ask this question: what is trauma? If you could please respond using your chat box, I'll see those answers, and so I'll get an idea of what you guys are thinking, and I'll read some of those answers right now. So what is trauma? Well, and I'm sorry, it seems like my chat box isn't letting me open it, so I'm not able to see those answers right now. So I'm so sorry, but I really do want to get your minds kind of thinking in that direction, because we all have different ideas of what trauma means. And this is actually a relatively recent question we've been asking ourselves. We've really just been thinking about this for about a century, maybe a little longer, but thinking about it very intensely for the past few decades. And in the grand scheme of history, that is barely any time at all. And so we're still trying to figure out exactly what the definitive answer is. And as we research more and we understand more, the boundaries of what trauma is keep expanding and expanding and expanding.
Okay, Caroline.
And so sometimes,
sorry to interfere. Yeah, we have got few answers from the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, some saying the emotional impact of events, a negative impact in someone's life that has created a scar.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Any event, major or repeated minor events, that impacts the functioning of an individual.
Ooh, these are great definitions.
Trauma is whatever interferes with our normal developmental stages in a negative manner that compromises our safety and security.
Exactly. You guys are so on track. I'm hearing so many good things that when we think about trauma, we're going to be talking about development. We're going to be talking about safety. We're going to be talking about how this impacts us across the life cycle. And I love hearing from all of you that that's already how the wheels of your mind are turning. So let's keep moving forward as we think about trauma. So here is kind of the textbook definition of what is trauma. Trauma means being exposed to some sort of stressful event or situation that creates an intense sense of fear, helplessness, or horror. And this stressful experience was so intense that it shaped the way a survivor defines the world and their own identity. And so these are two different things, and just to kind of broadly paint them, for me, trauma is a bad event happened, and I'm forever changed because of this bad event. And that's pretty general, but that's generally what we're looking at when we think about trauma. Trauma creates this fundamental shift in our very existence. And a lot of times we think of ourselves in terms of before the event and after the event. I think about, for instance, 9/11, and that's something we can all connect to on some level. You hear people all the time talk about how they know exactly where they were when that happened. I know I sure do. And a lot of times we think of ourselves as who we were before that happened and who we were after. And this is kind of the flavor of trauma, that something bad happens, something that creates a sense of fear, of helplessness, of horror, and this shapes the way we view ourselves and the world around us. So traumatic events are often sudden, unexpected, extreme. They can be life-threatening or seem life-threatening, and they involve an inability to escape. And so some examples would include things like accidents involving possibility of bodily injury, natural disasters, acts of violence, rape, abuse, all sorts of things like that. And I'm sure that these things are showing up in your offices as you work with clients. And I really like to think of these as two different clusters. The first being that it's sudden, unexpected, extreme, it's life-threatening, it gets your attention. You're exposed to this stressful event. This stressful event is powerful enough that it gets your attention. But it's the perceived lack of control or the inability to escape. That is really what sustains it over time. That is what gives you this sense of helplessness and hopelessness that creates this fundamental shift in identity that we're talking about. And this is what makes the treatment of trauma so necessary and so difficult, because it can give you this sense of shame and guilt. Life tested me. I had this big stressful event. I was tested by life, and because I was impacted by it, I failed. And so that's really a lot of what we're going to be seeing in our clients. And so I'd really love to kind of send it back to you guys and ask, what are the sort of traumatic events that your clients have experienced? What sort of traumas are you working with in your own practices? And Shruti, if that's something you can give me some answers for, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah. Abuse, homelessness, substance use, DV, rape, poverty, victim of crime, domestic violence, sexual abuse, sexual assault, exposure to torture, crime, human trafficking, physical abuse, high conflict custody disputes.
Okay. All right. That's a lot. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of abuse. I'm hearing a lot of these chronic stressors, and those are absolutely things that we're going to be addressing today. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad we're talking about this. It's so important with the clients that we're working with. So here's something that we also really want to keep in mind is perception during the traumatic event matters. I hate prank TV shows, like the Ashton Kutcher one. I forget the name of it. Punk'd, that was the name of it. I hate it, because it doesn't actually have to be dangerous for you to perceive it as traumatic and dangerous. And so every time I see one of these prank shows, my counselor brain is like, oh my gosh, these poor people may be traumatized. Perception matters so much. You must believe that you're in danger. Also, everyone experiences trauma differently. Two people can experience the exact same event and have different responses to trauma. We see this in families all the time. There may be sibling pairs where both siblings have experienced the exact same trauma and have completely different responses. And that's absolutely normal, and we have to make room for that in our practice. And this is important too, and this is a theme that I'm going to come back to. Clinicians who've experienced similar trauma need to allow room for difference in how they responded versus how their client responded to trauma. One thing that I love about being a helper is that so many people in helping professions were drawn to this because of their own life experiences, that there is this depth of life experience and compassion, and that is just so incredible and such an amazing resource that we bring to our field. But this must be a resource in that it helps us build compassion and deepen our empathy, but our own experiences cannot guide our treatment. And so we want to stay curious, we want to stay humble, and we want to willingly enter our clients' view of the world and what happened to them. And so a big red flag as well, when I experienced blank, I was able to blank. That's a big red flag. If you find yourself thinking that, really notice that, and that may be time for you to kind of dive into your own experiences. Okay. All right, so we also want to talk about the nature of the traumatic event and how this impacts healing. And one thing that I really want to really drive home today is that everybody needs healing, but healing is going to look different depending on the nature of the traumatic event. And so here's some differences we're looking at. A big T trauma versus a little t trauma. So a big T trauma, these are the ones that make headlines, the rape, the incredibly terrible car accident, these big major things that are very clearly traumatic. That's what we would call a big T trauma versus a little t trauma. And so I think about when I work with children, sometimes I've worked with children who fell off bikes, and we know as adults that they weren't really in danger, but they didn't know that, and now they're dealing with a lot of fear because of that. I want to share my own personal story a little bit. Don't worry, it's nothing major. When I first moved to Houston, I got into a car accident. It was not a big car accident. I was perfectly fine. Unfortunately, my car was totaled and we had to get a new one, but not a big deal. And so for me, this was a little T trauma. But this is what I think is so important, is that I still had some symptoms come up that I treated with mindfulness, with exposure, getting back into the car behind the wheel, things like that. But it still required healing. So I don't want us to discount the little T traumas that some of our clients have. Those matter too, and those definitely require some healing, although that healing is going to be very different than what we see when we're working people with these big T traumas. We also want to think about how the difference between a one-time or acute trauma versus an ongoing or chronic trauma is going to impact our client. Again, a one-time trauma like a car accident is going to heal differently than something like a chronic trauma like abuse or chronic stress, homelessness, a chronic illness that lasts over time. Again, both need healing, but healing is going to look very different in these clients. We also want to think about a shock trauma, something like a terrorist attack that was unexpected, one time, nobody saw it coming, maybe an assault, versus a developmental trauma. And we're going to really dive into developmental trauma. But developmental trauma is something like abuse, something that happens over a period of time, especially during childhood, that can impact really severely how someone grows and develops. So we want to think about the difference between those as well. As a clinician, we want to assess trauma history, assess. I cannot say this enough. We really want to know during the intake what our clients have experienced as much as possible, and we want to have our ears open as we work with clients as well. A lot of times, especially with these little T traumas, or these things that they may downplay, they won't come up in the intake, but it'll come up in sessions later on. So we want to pay attention to those as well. And one last thing that I want to note is that we want to think about the difference between a collective trauma and an individual trauma. Being in Houston, we just recently experienced a collective trauma with all the flooding left over from Hurricane Harvey. And honestly, everyone is affected in some way, shape, or form. And so many folks who are safe during the hurricane still feel traumatized and still are anxious. We recently had our first experience with rain, and I heard all of that day, everyone was just absolutely terrified. Children were terrified that it was raining again, even though that rain wasn't at all dangerous in the way that the rains from Hurricane Harvey were. And so these people still need healing, but this healing is going to look very different from those who were in danger or had major losses due to the natural disaster. So we want to keep that in mind too. So another aspect of trauma that I referred to earlier is that many of our clients have experienced complex developmental trauma. This means that they've experienced multiple traumas or ongoing trauma throughout their life. And this looks like significant disruptions in caregiving or attachment and security. And so with complex developmental trauma, what we're really talking about here is abuse and neglect a lot of times. We're looking at people who have a history of childhood abuse, didn't get the foundation in their life that they needed from a safe attachment figure, who didn't get the caregiving that they needed, and that impacted them developmentally along the way. So we're going to be treating people who've experienced complex developmental trauma different than we would treat people who didn't. And again, we want to just look at how did this impact their growth and development along the way. And something to look out for too is complex developmental trauma really impacts our sense of personal identity and our sense of our relationships with others. So you're really going to see how this shows up in adult romantic relationships, friendships, relationships with authority figures, and with complex developmental trauma, you're really going to be helping them heal relationships in their life. And then just to widen the boundaries of trauma even more, our understanding of neuroscience is expanding our view of what trauma means and its impact even further. So I want to talk about the research. This comes out of TCU, the Institute of Child Development. Some of you may be familiar with the TBRI, Trust-Based Relational Intervention. They work primarily with, or they started their work with families who had adopted children or were in the foster system, but they've expanded it now to what they refer to as children from hard places. And they've found that early risk factors for trauma responses and behaviors are much wider than just adoption and foster care, but include difficult pregnancy, difficult birth, early hospitalization, abuse, neglect, and trauma. And so those are things we also need to be screening for. We may see these trauma responses and be working with someone who has no trauma history, but that may actually be because of a difficult pregnancy, difficult birth, or early hospitalization. And so make sure you're screening for that as well, because that has the same kind of impact that trauma might have. And I want to talk about the Dutch winter of 1944 and 1945. In the German-occupied part of the Netherlands, there was a famine, and they've done really interesting research with the pregnant mothers during the time of the famine. So the pregnant mothers during this time were malnourished during their pregnancy, and so they themselves provided less nutrients and nourishment to their children during their pregnancy. But things bounced back fairly quickly. The famine ended and they were able to go back to a somewhat normal life. What researchers found was their children, even though they went back to a normal kind of life, were well nourished whenever they were children and grew up, they experienced the kind of stress cortisol levels, things like that, the kind of trauma responses that we see because of that difficult pregnancy. And their children, so the next generation, had similar indicators of past trauma. So the boundaries of what we understand as trauma are widening all the time. This is such a fascinating field of study, and I wish that we had hours and hours to talk about it, but unfortunately we need to move forward. But these are things you want to be screening for with your clients. Okay. And then someone mentioned earlier that they work with clients who've experienced homelessness. So chronic stressors that are environmental and include hassles related to conditions in the community, like lack of access to healthcare, education, housing, poverty, homelessness, inability to meet nutritional needs. These are what we call accumulated traumatic stressors. This comes from the work of Laurel Kaiser. She has a really wonderful program called Strengthening Family Coping Resources. And she talks about how these accumulated traumatic circumstances are so important to understand in three ways. Because first of all, they can be traumatic in and of themselves. Having a lack of appropriate education or healthcare, housing, things like that, can cause our families that we work with to exhibit the same kind of trauma responses, physiological trauma responses that someone would experience if they had a more traditional trauma. So they can be traumatic in and of themselves, but it doesn't end there. These accumulated traumatic circumstances, they exacerbate maladaptive trauma responses. So if we're already seeing a trauma response, it's not so helpful. If you don't have resources to help you move forward, that maladaptive trauma response just grows. And finally, it can limit access to protective factors and resiliency. So for instance, one of the more common protective factors we know is having, for instance, a positive adult attachment figure in your life, positive role models, things like that. Having a secure housing, having healthcare, having access to mental health care. All of these things, if you've experienced trauma, can help you move through and work through the trauma and get to resiliency sooner. But if you experience these accumulated traumatic circumstances, this can limit your access to the things that would help you heal in a healthier way. So we want to be paying attention. Environment matters so much when we're thinking about trauma, and that it can be traumatic, it can make our trauma responses worse, and it can limit our access to healing, essentially. And so this, if I had a thesis statement of this whole presentation, this is really what I would want you to take away from it, is that understanding the impact of trauma means shifting from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So this is a little bit less of a diagnostic model, really, when you think about it, because you're diving into how did the events of your life get you to where you are now? And that's so important. Some of my favorite researchers, Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson, they talk about this idea in parenting, where you chase the why. When you see these problem behaviors, you don't just stop at the behavior and try to control it or manage it, but you ask yourself, what function is this behavior serving? Why are they doing this right now? And I think that's so important when we work with traumatized clients. We've got to chase the why. And part of how we chase the why is through our intake and assessment process. These are vital and an integral part of trauma-informed care. And so we really want to make sure that we're doing as much screening and asking good questions as we can right as they come through our door. All right. So hopefully we've answered in some ways the question of what is trauma, or hopefully expanded your view of what trauma is. But now we want to talk about, how does trauma impact us? What does trauma look like in our day-to-day life? What are our trauma responses? And there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. So I'm going to talk about two different ways we can think about this. The first is a more clinical, medical, diagnostic model. And this would be looking at PTSD. And then there's some other proposed diagnoses that I want to cover too. One is complex PTSD and the other is developmental trauma disorder. And we're going to dive into that. As a clinician, you should be really familiar with what a formal diagnosis of PTSD means, but it's also important to know that there's a lot of controversy around this diagnosis in particular. And post-traumatic stress, so someone who doesn't fit the diagnosis of PTSD for whatever reason, that person still may be experiencing post-traumatic stress and still needs healing and treatment. And so it's important not to just feel like you have to check the box of PTSD and be done with it. We also want to think about things in a more holistic, non-diagnostic way that views trauma's impact across multiple areas of life and functioning, including the non-clinical symptoms. So we want to see, how does this impact your relationships? How does this impact your view of yourself? How does this impact your ability to get housing? How does this impact all sorts of areas of your life, apart from what are the cognitive and emotional impacts of trauma? But before we get to that, we really want to make sure we understand, what do we mean when we say PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? So this is as much of the diagnosis that I could fit on one PowerPoint screen. But here's generally what we're looking at. For PTSD, you need to be exposed to a traumatic event. You need the presence of intrusive symptoms associated with the traumatic event. And that looks like flashbacks, nightmares, general intrusive thoughts. Some clients I've seen report kind of seeing hallucinations or delusional kind of stuff. I've definitely seen that with PTSD, but these intrusive symptoms need to be there. Also, persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event. And so what avoidance looks like, after my car accident, you could not for $1 million get me to go back, drive through the intersection. I avoided the intersection where the car accident took place. So clients with PTSD, they're avoiding things that might be reminders of the traumatic event. Also, negative alteration in cognitions and mood, marked alterations in arousal and reactivity. We're really going to talk about this associated with the event. The duration is greater than a month, and it causes clinically significant distress or impairment of social or occupational functioning, and it's not attributable to effects of a substance or medical condition. So here's some things that I want you to take away. The primary things that I want you to keep in mind when we're looking for PTSD. We're looking for the intrusive symptoms, you're looking for the avoidance behaviors, and you're looking for the hyperarousal, so the hypervigilance, the paranoia, things like that. Those I feel like are the primary aspects that you're looking for with PTSD. And I really want to drive this point home that a lot of people aren't going to meet this clinical definition. They may just be experiencing post-traumatic stress without fitting a diagnosis of PTSD, but they still require healing and need treatment. And sometimes our response to trauma can be, what we'll talk about later, is a pride-based response. Some people overfunction in light of trauma, and we really don't have diagnoses for overfunctioners, but we do know that they need healing as well. And so I want you to keep that in mind. Okay. So let's talk about the work of Judith Herman. Judith Herman, you need to read her Trauma and Recovery if you're working with traumatized clients. It's one of the best books about trauma, along with Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. But Judith Herman, she's going to talk about what she calls complex PTSD. And so Judith Herman, she came from a feminist perspective because she worked primarily with adult women who had experienced abuse throughout their childhood, and some were victims of sex trafficking. And so she said, you know what I'm seeing with my clients is different than what others are describing when they talk about PTSD. And this, I think, is so important. In her work, if I remember correctly, it's from the early 90s. So we've shifted our understanding of PTSD a little bit. But her critique was that PTSD was developed based on experiences of combat vets. And this is an absolutely necessary viewpoint, but this does not cover the experiences of abuse survivors or many other trauma survivors. So we need to ask other abuse survivors, what is this like for you? So what she says about complex PTSD is that for someone to get her diagnosis of CPTSD, they would need a history of totalitarian control, like abuse, alterations in affect regulation, so difficulty regulating their emotion, alterations in consciousness, so specifically this would be dissociation, which is something that can happen due to trauma where someone separates their consciousness in a way from their body as a way to survive the experience. So dissociation, alterations in self-perception, so I am bad, alterations in the perception of the perpetrator. She talks about this where over time you start to think that the person who's doing you wrong maybe has a right to do it, or maybe there's a little bit of what we would call Stockholm syndrome involved. You start to think they are good or they're correct or I'm really the bad one here. And this changes your relationships with others and your system of meaning making. So this is very different than the PTSD diagnosis. And then to look at it from another perspective, Bessel van der Kolk and the folks at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network talk about what they call developmental trauma disorder. And so they have been actually proposing this to the DSM throughout, as they've made changes to the DSM, because they really think it's important that we understand how complex developmental trauma is different than, it presents differently than PTSD. So here's what they have to say about that. They say that for developmental trauma disorder, you need exposure to a prolonged trauma as a child or adolescent. Again, so we're talking about severe issues in caregiving or abuse, things like that, neglect. Affective and physiological dysregulation. So they're looking at how does this dysregulate your physical experience, your body, and your emotions. Attention and behavioral dysregulation. I'm telling you, I've seen a lot of kids who've experienced trauma who fit the diagnosis for ADHD. That really, I believe, when you get down to it, the attention issues and the behavioral issues are actually more connected to trauma. Self and relational dysregulation, and then post-traumatic spectrum symptoms. So I bring all of this up because I think it's so important to be aware that there's different ideas about trauma, and that no two people experience trauma the exact same way. And even among researchers, there's different ways of thinking about this. So I think it's so important to know the conversation that we're having about trauma and PTSD. But I want to take a look at this from a different perspective, from what I think is a more holistic perspective, and really take a look at what are the areas of life that trauma impacts? What are the areas of functioning that trauma impacts? And how does this change beliefs that people have about themselves? How does this shift someone's core belief about their life or the world around them, as we talked about earlier, that fundamental shift? So, and I also want you to think about what would a healthy version or core belief be, and how would that contrast to these more negative core beliefs? Okay, so we know trauma impacts our ability to regulate our emotions. We may believe things like, because the worst can happen, I'm more afraid. I'm worried that there's something around every corner, and that makes me much more hypersensitive and emotionally reactive, and it's difficult to regulate my emotions because of that. We also know, and this is a whole area of research, this could be its whole own presentation, but we know that trauma impacts our bodies, our development, and our physical selves. Trauma is truly an embodied experience. And if this is something that's interesting to you, I would point you to the work of Robert Sapolsky on stress, Peter Levine, Babette Rothschild. They all do such great work on this idea of trauma as something that you experience in the body. It's not just a cognitive experience. And this is something that's so especially important when we think about abuse survivors, especially sexual abuse survivors, They may develop this belief that their body is shameful or broken, and people may physically experience pain due to trauma. So we want to keep all of that in mind. Trauma also impacts our attachments and our relationships with others. We may believe that we're unlovable or people only want to hurt us because of our trauma. It shifts how we view the nature of humans. It also shifts our relationship to ourselves and our own sense of identity, asking ourselves things like, who am I? Am I responsible for what happened? What does it mean about me? What does it say about me that I wore that particular outfit on the night I was raped? What does this say about who I am as a person? And of course, our societal ideas about these things don't particularly help. But again, that's a separate presentation. It also impacts our ability to cope with and manage stress, that life feels overwhelming and unpredictable. That part of how we manage stress is by developing healthy routines, by taking good care of ourselves, and that becomes really difficult when you've experienced trauma, or if you believe that all routine is folly because at any moment your entire world could be upended. And finally, this is such an important question, and I think it's one that we resist sometimes. Trauma absolutely impacts our sense of spirituality and connectedness in whatever sense that means for the client. So that might look like someone asking a question like, how can a good God let bad things happen? Or zoom out a little bit, that might look like, what does it mean that in the universe there is evil or pain? This can bring up all sorts of deep existential questions for our clients, and we need to be willing to engage with them in those deep world shifting kind of questions that trauma brings up for them. So we are going to focus primarily on trauma in the brain and trauma in our relationships with others, just for the sake of time, and because I think that these are truly foundational as we work to help our clients heal from trauma. So here's what I want you to really understand about trauma in the brain. When we feel threatened, we often go into a diffuse physiological arousal state, or a DPA state. And so what that means is that when we feel threatened, I mean, you can feel it. You feel it in your gut. You feel the hair on your neck standing up. You're ready for action. You feel it in your body. Again, trauma is an embodied experience. And this state of threat isn't just, it's not exclusive to people who've experienced trauma. This is pretty universal. So we go into this DPA state. We also know this state is flooding. For those of you who are couples counselors, work with couples, this flooding DPA state comes from the work of John Gottman, actually. I mean, he talks about whenever a couple is arguing, if they get flooded, they need to end the argument, take a break for about 30 minutes, calm down, and then come back, because you can't have a good argument in this state. But it's also known as flooding or fight, flight, or freeze stress or fear response. So that's more commonly how we talk about this DPA state. When we're in a DPA state, our responses are limited, and our ability to learn and judge accurately is greatly diminished. And this is adaptive. This is absolutely adaptive. Think about this for a moment. If you are a gazelle out in the African Serengeti, and all of a sudden you become aware of the fact that a lion has started to pursue you and chase you, in that moment, you need all of your focus to be on getting out of this and surviving. And so our bodies, when we're in this kind of mode, we get really efficient. Our bodies aren't worried so much about anything other than, how do I survive? How do I get from point A to point B and stay alive? And so this limits our responses, which again is good if you're a gazelle in the Serengeti running from a lion, but not particularly good when you're a human being trying to have relationships with others that are so nuanced and complex. And trauma can lock us into this state and make it easier for us to enter this state. So some of the folks we work with, they're going to be in this all the time. They are constantly blowing and going, and they're going to feel hyper aroused all the time. Others, they're going to be able to self-soothe, they're going to be able to come down, but it's going to be a lot easier for them to get to that state. So again, trauma, and especially developmental trauma, it can lock our brains into this state of high alert, and we call this hypervigilance. So with hypervigilance, this is the feeling of perpetually being on guard. You're kind of looking around every corner trying to see, is there a threat over there? Is there a threat over there? It's also difficult to self-soothe when you're hypervigilant because there's a part of your brain that says, there's a threat around the next corner. If you let your guard down, someone's going to get you. And there can be paranoia about community living or staff. And here's what I mean about that. One of my previous positions that I had was working with single moms and their families who had come out of homelessness, and it was a residential facility. So these moms who had experienced all sorts of accumulated traumatic stressors and all sorts of traumas, they had learned that people couldn't be trusted, and so they were incredibly paranoid about the staff, about the people who lived in the homes with them, and this hypervigilance could make work pretty difficult sometimes. But this is all just part of what it means to experience trauma. When we're locked into a hypervigilant state, our brain continually releases those stress hormones, and this makes it very difficult for us to focus on any one activity. And this is not good news, this stressed out state makes us less resilient over time. So treatment is so important. We want to help our clients right this ship because we know that this can make us less resilient over time and even more prone to physical ailments as well. So this is such an important idea. When we experience this fear response, we focus strictly on meeting our survival needs. And again, those survival needs are things like safety, hunger and thirst, fatigue, escaping scary situations, making the hurt stop and go away, and staying in control. And it is hard to get out of survival mode, but it's helpful to think about it as survival mode. And in my work with clients, I've noticed that as we frame it as survival, there's room for honoring their strategies while still creating room for change. That if they can honor the fact that, yes, you're trying to survive right now, but you don't need to survive right now. Right now is about thriving. That can be such a helpful treatment goal. But it's also helpful for us to know that if we're working with clients who are in this hyper-aroused state, this DPA state, their options are going to be limited. Their worldview is going to be limited. Often they're going to view things in terms of black and white. There's going to be less of a future focus. There's going to be difficulty with goal setting, and all those things are therapeutic issues that are going to come up. And this is so incredibly important. When we are experiencing the fear response, we cannot grasp discussions, sermons, lectures, complex reasoning, logic, stories, philosophical discussions, abstract concepts, solving puzzles, math. All that stuff goes out the window. Again, our brain becomes very efficient and very focused on getting us from point A to point B. And sermons, moralizing, all those sort of things, complex reasoning, that just goes out the window because it's not necessary to survival. And so this is so important when your first goal in working with traumatized clients is to help them calm the nervous system. And we calm the nervous system through connection most of the time. Then, and only once you have done that, then you can move toward problem solving. And so all of these things are secondary to returning to a place of calm. So when I do this lecture with a live audience, what I like to do, if they're game, is to have everyone get up and spin in a circle several times and then try to say the alphabet backwards. You just can't do it. And it's so funny to watch everyone try, but you absolutely cannot do it because you have to think about the alphabet in order to say it backwards. And if you're physically just regulated like that, that simulates this kind of fear stress response. And you just can't do both at the same time. So keep in mind, a lot of the clients that you work with, this is where they live. This is absolutely where they live. So you want to help bring them back to that state of regulation and that state of calm before you try to do the future focused goal setting kind of stuff with them. And trauma, we know as well, impacts our relationships. And this is especially true about developmental trauma where there's been impaired attachment figures, there's been insufficient caregiving. This impacts our relationships with others. And developmental trauma impacts 5 primary areas of life that creates either a shame or pride-based response. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But it impacts our ability to connect with others. It impacts our ability to attune. It impacts our ability to trust. It impacts our sense of autonomy and our sense of love and sexuality. And you can see all of these areas have major impacts on our relationships with others. So let's talk about what I mean, though, by shame or pride-based response. Actually, before we do that, let's talk about the dialectic of trauma because that ties in. So when reading Judith Herman's work, Trauma and Recovery, when I read this sentence, I just wanted to highlight it in every single color, put this quote on my wall, because this made so much sense of what I was seeing clinically. And so what she says is the conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is the central dialectic of trauma. Symptoms simultaneously call attention to the existence of an unspeakable secret and deflect attention from it. Now, I called this, before I knew there was a fancy name called the dialectic of trauma, I just called this the push-pull effect. And I experienced that with my clients, that a lot of times there'd be this push toward a pride-based response of I'm going to overfunction. And then there would be this pull toward a shame-based response. I'm going to underfunction. And this is so incredibly important to understand. One of the books that I've read about borderline personality disorder, which we know BPD is connected pretty intimately with trauma, is called I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. And that is such a perfect title, because it captures this dialectic of trauma, this push, this pull, this shame-based identification, this pride-based identification, the will to deny, the will to proclaim. And we really want to be thinking about how do these symptoms that show up in our office and sometimes drive us crazy, how are these either calling attention to the existence of an unspeakable secret or deflecting attention away from it? And here's what that looks like. We really want to help our clients find balance after trauma. I love this idea from DBT called wise mind. And the idea of wise mind is when you combine the more cognitive aspects of yourself with the more emotional aspects of yourself. You bring those together in a balanced way. That's your most intuitive, wise self. And that's in a way what we're looking at when we work with people who've experienced trauma. So here's some of the spectrums where we're going to see this dialectic play out. Trust. Some of our clients may be avoiding trust, be incredibly guarded. I don't trust you, get out of my life, maybe pushing you away. And then we have others that are over trusting. They may engage in romantic relationships with people who are incredibly untrustworthy, and it just makes you want to hit your head against the wall that this keeps happening over and over again. We want to help them come to this wise, trusting and open, but still wise place of trust. Also, when it comes to connection and intimacy, we want to help them appropriately self-disclose and be vulnerable with safe others, instead of avoiding that altogether or over-seeking it. In terms of autonomy, we want to help our clients be capable but able to ask for help. With autonomy, on either end of the spectrum, you have this kind of lone wolf independence of I don't need anybody, I'm going to do this all by myself. And then on the other hand, you need this under-functioning codependency that pops up, and we want to help our clients return to that place of equilibrium. Also, in terms of initiative and competence, where they're decisive, but they're not impulsive, but they're also not avoidant. And identity, having a clear sense of identity as opposed to a rigid sense of this is who I am and no one can give me feedback, or an unclear sense of I don't even know, or identity disturbance. So this can look like inconsistency, but it's all part of the process. I've had clients go from seeking to avoiding in one session. I've had others who are primarily seeking and others who are primarily avoiding, but all of that is really normal and part of the trauma process. So I do want to make you aware of that. This can make your head spin though as a clinician. And so make sure you're consulting and you're engaging in self-care to help you get some perspective on where they're at in the dialectic. And remember, trauma responses are adaptive. Trauma responses or behaviors may be indicative of coping mechanisms, like a teenage abuse survivor who self-harms is a way to manage the pain from flashbacks of the abuse. This is something I've seen over and over again, where parents will bring in a teenage abuse survivor to treat the self-harm with no thought for treating the underlying abuse that happened, when really the self-harm is just how they cope with it. And so real, true healing is going to address both. It also may be indicative of a survival technique. A neglected child may hoard food or have a meltdown at meal times. Hello, that's how they survived. It also may be indicative of resiliency. An abuse survivor mom may be reluctant to open up to caregivers because of previous abusive caregivers. This is something we saw in residential settings all the time, and it was easy to pathologize their lack of trust in us. But really, this was how they survived and how they made it to us alive. All right, so let's move into our final section. What is trauma-informed care? Now that you know all this, you're becoming really aware of it, what does this look like implemented in your setting? So trauma-informed care, and this is one of those sentences, one of those definitions that has so much packed in it, so please just hang in there with me. But trauma-informed care is a strengths-based framework that is grounded in an understanding of and responsiveness to trauma that emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers and survivors, and that creates opportunities for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. There's a lot in there, so let's break it down to the 4 primary themes of trauma-informed care. With trauma-informed care, we're looking at trauma awareness. Providers who work with traumatized individuals need to be aware of what trauma is. It's something that they need to be educated on and engaging and learning more. And so good news, everyone. What you're doing today is engaging in trauma-informed care as you seek to learn more about trauma and its impact. Trauma-informed care is also going to emphasize safety for both survivors and providers. And so what this looks like is predictability and healthy boundaries. Boundaries are going to be tested along the way quite a bit as we try to feel safe again. But we really want to emphasize predictability and healthy boundaries so that everybody feels really safe and trustworthy. Trauma-informed care is also going to have plenty of opportunities to rebuild control. This looks like choices. This looks like allowing the survivor to be the author of their own story. This looks like allowing them to define themselves. And this can be really difficult as a clinician when you're bursting with all of this information about trauma and its impact. It can be really difficult to, in a way, let them lead. But that is one of the themes of trauma-informed care. We want to help them rebuild control over their own life. And finally, for all of this, we want to take a strengths-based approach, remembering that the things that may drive us crazy, the trauma responses that give them the most difficulty, can actually be evidence of survival strategies, resiliency, and coping mechanisms, and that they have the strength within themselves to move forward. We really want to emphasize that as we work with traumatized individuals. Judith Herman had another way of talking about this. Her recovery model includes 3 primary stages that are all on a common pathway. And those 3 stages are establishing safety. Again, that's something important that comes up pretty often. We're going to do that again through boundaries and through predictability. Reconstructing the trauma story. And as an outpatient therapist, this is basically what we do a lot of times in talk therapy. We help our clients reconstruct the trauma story in a different way than they've done. And so recreating the trauma narrative may be reframing it from a story of shame and guilt to a story of power and resilience. And that's not something that you want to do super quickly, because that can come across as dismissive. And that's certainly something that you want to help them take the lead on. But they're going to need to reconstruct, retell the trauma story in a way that's not re-traumatizing, in a way that feels safe, and in a way where they become the hero of their own story. And then finally, the 3rd stage for Judith Herman is restoring connection and relationships. She thinks that one of the primary areas of impact for trauma is our connections to other people, that people become scary, but also we need them more than ever. So it's helping our clients learn how to have healthy relationships with others that are in this balanced way. And all 3 of these stages are guided by the principle of re-empowerment of the trauma survivor, that all of this is about helping them feel like they are the boss of themselves, that they're in control of their own life. And this is the last thing I want to mention before opening it up to questions, but this is, again, so important. Working with traumatized clients, it's hard work, y'all. It's really hard work. Because of the risk of countertransference, it's so important that you do your own work and make sense of your own history and trauma before, during, and after working with these clients. Your own stuff is going to come up. As you hear their hard stories, that's going to remind you of some of your own hard stories. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean that you're a bad therapist. All that means is that you need to be doing your own work and making sense of your own history. It's so important for us to do our own counseling when need be, engage in our own support groups, whether that's a consultation group or other trusted therapist friends, and frequently debriefing and having good check-ins with maybe the staff of where you're working. That is also important. And this comes from the work of Karen Purvis out of TCU. She says that parents can't take their children somewhere they haven't been themselves. And I think that's so true for therapists as we work with clients, that we cannot take our clients somewhere we haven't been ourselves. healing trauma is hard work that impacts so many areas of our life and takes so much courage. And we can't take our clients there if we haven't engaged in our own battles with our own dragons. And so all that being said, take care of yourself, do your own work, engage in self-care. And this is such an integral part of helping our clients heal trauma. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the presentation portion. And so I want to go ahead and send this back to Shruti and open it up for questions.
All right. Thanks, Caroline. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Okay. And people are like appreciating you for the excellent presentation. There is a person called Janice. She's saying that she has a session with a new guy next week, and she can't wait to use what she learned today from this presentation.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, and people are like, we are receiving lots of appreciation messages from all around the world.
Oh, good. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, so everyone, thanks audience for attending this webinar. So we are moving to the next round of this presentation, to the question answer round. So please use the chat box provided in the GoToWebinar right-hand pane to ask questions if you have any. Okay, so we got a question from Catherine. Do you find that, do you find that there is extreme codependency issues like control and manipulation in trauma survivors?
Yes. So I want to push back a little bit on using the word codependent. And again, that's a personal thing because codependent sounds so, I don't know, it sounds like such a negative thing when really this is how a lot of our clients survive. I also tend to think of things in a more attachment perspective and a codependency model, but absolutely you're going to see a lot of difficulty in attachment relationships. You're going to see a lot of difficulties trusting others. You're going to see a lot of sometimes hyper functioning that we see in these codependency kind of relationships where someone will take responsibility and maybe provide the kind of parenting for a partner, for instance, who's under functioning that maybe they didn't receive themselves. So absolutely, that's going to be typical of a lot of the clients that we see because we know trauma plays out on the stage of relationships all the time.
Thank you. Moving to the next question. It's from Valeria. How can trauma relate to someone running away, and what approach can we take or how we can help them reduce the running away?
Oh, yeah. So I've worked with a lot of teenagers in my career, and running away was such an incredibly common issue that came up. And so with running away, I would generally see that it was one of two things. I would see, first of all, that they weren't feeling safe at their home. And so that's something that I would want to address first of all. Are they actually physically safe at their home? And if they're not, then that's an environmental issue that needs to be addressed. But what I would honestly see more frequently was that the running away was about needing to, they would enter the DPA state, the state of flooding, and not know how to appropriately manage it and just know that they needed to get out of the situation. And so they would do that by running away. A lot of times this isn't actually a negative if we can help them do this in a productive and adaptive way. If we can help the teens that we work with find ways to disengage from stressful situations or de-escalate stressful situations, or maybe instead of run away, take a run around the block so that we feel okay about their safety. So really, when I work with clients who run away, I'm looking for, are they actually not safe at home? And so this is about them establishing safety. Or are they just struggling with managing this fight or flight tendency that comes up? And if that's the case, we want to help give them different coping skills for when they enter that state.
Thank you. Moving to the next question from Janice. Please comment on what to work with for adults who experience serious loss of family member as adolescents in a serious traumatic settings and struggles with establishing connection to others outside of family after a lifestyle of a successful career, cultural issues.
Okay, so I don't know if I quite heard that correctly, but it sounds like you have a client who lost a parent or a caregiver at a young age due to really traumatic circumstances, and that grief is kind of coming back up for them later in life. And I think a big part of that would be helping them kind of honestly address some of the issues. It sounds like since it's coming up later in life and I'm maybe hearing that there's some overfunctioning going on, that maybe because of the overfunctioning, they didn't get the care, nurture, and healing that they needed. I'm wondering if maybe, people looked at them and thought, oh, they're really making it, they're really doing okay, and so they didn't get the kind of care and concern that they needed at the time. And so this may involve helping them kind of let go of some of the overfunctioning and address the underlying stuff so that they can have healthy relationships. And I would refer them to Harriet Lerner's Dance of Intimacy. I think that would be a really great book for them to be able to address some of this overfunctioning that they're doing as a result of their childhood stuff.
Right, thank you. Moving to the next question. It's from Heather Brown. She's saying that I work as a therapist with women and children in a homeless shelter. The information on complex trauma was so helpful. So many of them have histories of abuse, addiction to chronic homelessness. Due to the fact that I only meet with clients for a short period of time, can you give me any suggestions for how to provide the best short-term interventions?
Yes, absolutely. So if you were working with people who, I was really fortunate, the residence I was working at was a long-term living situation. So we had much longer to work with our clients, but we really want to pay attention to where are they at. So we don't necessarily want to help clients do the deep trauma processing if they are just coming out of homelessness and they're in crisis mode. Our goal then is just to help them get calm, return to a state of peace as much as they possibly can. That is step one. And so my gut tells me that in your particular situation, you're going to be using a lot of boundaries, a lot of establishing safety, and a lot of your own personal connection with them and the empathy that you use in your work to help kind of bring their nervous system down from high alert so that they can start making some decisions about how to have a different kind of future. And so for you, since you do have that short term, your goal is not so much to help them process that deep trauma stuff, but your goal would be to connect with them enough to bring them out of that flooded DPA kind of state so they can return to a place of calm and peace so they can make the decisions they need to make as they move forward, all through the lens of empathy and compassion, understanding that what they went through is often impacting where they are now.
Thank you, Caroline. And moving to the last question of this session from Jonalie. Is there a resource you would recommend to read on wise mind treatment?
So I'm actually not a DBT person. I love DBT, but I'm not a DBT clinician. And so I would refer you to the work of Marsha Linehan. She's, DBT guru, founder of DBT. So she would be someone who I would refer you to. There's also a book that I occasionally use with some of my clients who have symptoms of borderline features. I forget the name of it. It's a light green workbook about borderline. And that's something that if you can email me or get my contact information, I'm happy to give you that resource. But it's a wonderful workbook that uses a lot of the DBT. It might just be called Dialectical Behavioral Therapy for Borderline Personality Disorder, actually, now that I'm thinking of it. But that's a great resource that you can use as a workbook to go through with clients using some of those principles.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And we are receiving a lot of questions, and it is not possible to answer every question in the 1 hour presentation. So whatever questions are left, we will respond to them individually after this webinar finishes. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar and for your participation. If you have any further questions regarding this presentation or your CE certificate or anything, you just need to send your questions to webinar@solvehealth.com. I repeat, it's webinar@solvehealth.com. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a thank you email within 48 hours with all the information pertaining to this webinar and how you can earn your CE certificate. So now I will let you know about how, because a lot of our audience are having problems downloading their CE certificate. So here I will let you know how you can download your CE certificate. You just need to go on our website www.solveinstitute.com. When you open this website, you will see the home page of this website. Yeah, the home page will look like this. There is an option there is a short window of signing up. You just need to enter your credential in there, and you just need to sign up over there. After you sign up here, you will land on the next page where you will see a lot of presentations. You just need to select the presentation you want to watch a recording for, or for which you want to download your C certificate. After pressing the presentation you want to watch, you will end up on the next page. Here you will see all the information about that webinar, and in the right hand corner you will see a continue to video button. You just need to press that. After pressing that, you can watch the presentation, and then you can then you will land up on the next page where you will find a short button at the very right hand corner, which will say continue to quiz button. After answering the quiz question, you can download your C certificate. And if you still have confusions, you can send me your queries at webinar@sovhealth.com. I will answer it. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. We hope you found this information valuable. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll look forward to bring more interesting webinar each month. So keep joining us, and goodbye.